Well done, Lucky,
Who's going to open the treasure chest?
asked Carlos, looking at Mike and Kate.
Mike, you took the old map,
Said Kate.
so you can open the treasure chest.
Mike slowly opened the old chest. Suddenly, the three friends jumped back and Kate screamed. There was something terrible inside. A skeleton. Lucky started barking loudly. The skeleton was wearing pirate's clothes and a big black hat. Mike, Kate, and Carlos stared at it and didn't know what to say. They were very surprised and scared. Kate spoke first.
Is this the treasure? It's terrible.
Maybe there's something else in the treasure chest,
Said Carlos. He slowly moved closer to the chest and looked inside.
There's nothing inside except the skeleton,
He said sadly.
Why did someone put the body of a pirate inside the treasure chest and lock it?
Asked Mike. Suddenly, Lucky started barking again. The three friends turned around and saw that water was coming down the stone steps.
What's happening?
Asked Kate nervously.
Why is water coming in here?
Oh no, the tide!
Said Mike.
It's high tide, and these caves fill up with seawater. We have to get out of here now.
But wait,
Said Carlos.
perhaps there's a clue or another map in the skeleton's clothes, in his pockets.
Are you going to touch it?
Asked Kate, who was scared.
I'll just touch his clothes.
Said Carlos.
We have to hurry.
Said Mike.
If more water comes in, we'll be in big trouble.
Carlos started touching the skeleton's clothes. He looked in all the pockets, but found nothing. Then he took off the big black hat and looked inside it.
There's something inside the hat.
Cried Carlos.
It's an old piece of paper that says Juan Martinez de los Robles.
He took the old piece of paper and showed it to Kate and Mike.
Maybe that was his name.
Said Kate.
No, I don't think so.
Said Mike.
You don't write your name on a piece of paper and put it in your hat. I think it's a clue.
Carlos quickly put the piece of paper in his pocket. Lucky started barking loudly again because a lot of water was now coming into the cave. Mike picked him up. The three friends couldn't get out because water was coming down the stone steps, and the cave was quickly filling up with water. They were in big trouble.
How can we get out of here?
Asked Kate, who was now starting to get very scared.
The water is almost up to my knees.
There's only one way out.
Said Mike, looking at the small hole high above their heads.
But we can't climb up there.
Said Carlos.
It's impossible. We need someone on the outside to throw down a rope.
I have an idea.
Said Mike.
Kate, if you hold Lucky, Carlos and I can lift you. Then you can push Lucky up to the top. He's small and light and can get out of the hole.
Mike looked at Lucky, who was in his arms, and said,
Listen carefully, Lucky. Go and find help.
Carlos and Mike lifted Kate and Lucky. It wasn't easy, but they were able to get Kate quite high, and she pushed Lucky outside. There were a lot of people on the beach that day, and when Lucky got out of the hole, he started barking loudly and running around.
What's that dog doing?
Said a tall young man who was sitting on the beach with some friends.
He's very excited.
said his friend.
He's trying to tell us something.
Perhaps someone needs help.
Said another young man.
Let's follow him and see.
The four young men followed Lucky to the small hole and looked inside.
Does anyone need help?
Shouted the tall young man.
Yes, the water in the cave is up to our knees, and we can't get out.
Shouted Mike.
Can you please help us?
It's high tide.
Shouted the young man.
Don't worry. We can get you out of there. I've got a rope in my car. Wait a moment and I'll be back.
He ran across the beach to the parking lot, got a long rope from his car, and ran back.
Okay, listen.
Shouted the young man who was standing over the hole.
I'm gonna send this rope down to you. Hold on to it. Then my friends and I will pull you up.
Okay.
Shouted Kate, Mike, and Carlos. The four young men pulled Kate up first, then Carlos, and then Mike. Lucky jumped into Kate's arms and looked at her.
Thanks, Lucky.
Said Kate, smiling at the little black dog.
And thank you.
She said, looking at the four young men.
Yeah,
Said Mike.
thanks a lot.
You were very kind to help us.
Said Carlos.
We were in big trouble down there.
You guys are lucky.
Said one of the men.
I always keep a rope in my car because my friends and I are mountain climbers.
What were you doing in the cave?
Asked the tall young man.
Oh, we were just looking around?
Said Mike, and his face became red.
Oh, well, it's getting late.
Said Kate.
We have to go back to Bodega Bay. Thanks again for your help.
We were happy to help you,
Said the tall young man.
but next time, be careful.
Okay, we will.
Said the three friends. Chapter 6. The Hacienda Estrada. Mike, Kate, and Carlos got back to the Pelican at dinner time.
Hi.
Said Mr. Sullivan.
We did a lot of interesting work today at Point Reyes. We saw 2 great white sharks swimming by. Tomorrow we're going to the Farallon Islands.
How was your day?
Asked Mrs. Sullivan.
Interesting.
Said Mike, looking at his sister and Carlos.
We explored the beach.
Said Carlos.
Are you guys getting bored?
Asked Mr. Sullivan.
Bored?
Said Kate, smiling.
No, of course not.
The next morning after breakfast, Mr. and Mrs. Sullivan sailed to the Farallon Islands. It was a foggy morning, and the three friends stood on the pier and talked about their scary adventure in the cave. Carlos took out the old piece of paper he found in the skeleton's hat and looked at it.
Is this a clue? What does it mean?
He asked.
It's the name of a man. Or perhaps it isn't.
Said Kate.
Let's take another look at the map.
Said Mike.
Why don't we go to the tourist office and ask about the Hacienda Estrada?
Said Kate.
Perhaps we can get some useful information.
Okay.
Said Carlos.
I'm sure the treasure is here somewhere.
Margaret Healy worked at the Bodega Bay tourist office and knew all about the history of the town.
The Estrada family was a rich and important family in the 1600s.
Said Margaret.
They were the first to build a home and a big farm here, the Hacienda Estrada. The family's only daughter was called Isabella, and she married a sea captain called Juan Martinez. Soon after their marriage, he was killed during a terrible fight with pirates, and his young wife never married again. She was always sad and dressed in black. She rarely left the hacienda.
What a sad story.
said Kate.
Was the captain's last name Robles or de los Robles?
Asked Mike,
No,
answered Margaret.
his last name was Martinez.
Where was he buried?
Asked Carlos,
No one knows.
said Margaret.
What about the old town cemetery?
Asked Kate.
It's about 400 years old, and no one can read the names on the tombstones anymore.
She said.
If you're looking for old Spanish things, go and see the lighthouse at Twin Oaks Point. It's on the cliff.
The three friends thanked her and left. They decided to follow the treasure map and go to the area northwest of Bodega Bay. They climbed up the green hills and stopped near a stone wall.
What's this?
Asked Mike, looking at the map.
It looks like part of the old Hacienda Estrada.
Said Carlos.
Look, there's a small river nearby, too. The same river that's on the map.
They looked around and saw another stone wall and some steps.
This looks like a wall of a house. Maybe the hacienda.
Said Kate.
Yeah, but there's almost nothing here.
Said Mike.
Let's move on and see if we can find the cemetery.
They walked to the cliff and a strong wind was blowing. From the top of the cliff they could see the Pacific Ocean.
What a beautiful place.
Said Kate, looking at the green-blue sea.
Let's stop here and have lunch. I'm hungry.
We are too.
Said Mike and Carlos. They sat down and had chicken sandwiches and fruit juice.
Hey, look down there.
Said Carlos, eating his sandwich. From the top of the cliff, they saw the old cemetery that was on Salamanca's map and the old Spanish lighthouse. After lunch, they slowly climbed down and got to the old cemetery.
There isn't much here.
Said Mike.
Just a few very old tombstones and lots of grass.
Gee, look at this one.
Said Kate.
I can't read the name, but the date is 1624. This place is probably full of ghosts. Let's go. I'm scared.
Carlos laughed and said,
We'll never find the treasure here.
Perhaps there isn't any treasure.
Said Kate.
I'm sure there's a treasure.
Said Mike.
Don't forget that Captain Salamanca was looking for it, and we have his map.
You're right, Mike.
Said Carlos.
We have to study the clues carefully. The name Juan Martinez de los Robles means something. But what? We have to find out.
Chapter 7. The Old Lighthouse.
Let's go and see the old lighthouse at Twin Oaks Point.
Said Carlos.
Lighthouses are always interesting.
It was a windy day, and they walked along the cliff for almost an hour to get there. There was an old stone lighthouse on the cliff above the sea near two big oak trees.
This was probably an important lighthouse in Captain Salamanca's days.
Said Mike.
Those two big oak trees look very old, too.
That's why people called it Twin Oaks Point.
Said Kate, laughing. Carlos suddenly turned around and looked at the two oak trees.
Wait a minute.
He said.
The Spanish word for oak is roble, and the words de los Robles are written next to Juan Martinez's name. That means of the oaks. Perhaps Robles isn't part of his last name, but a clue.
Oh, you're right, Carlos.
Said Mike.
Robles could be a clue.
Perhaps he is buried under the oak trees. There are only 2 oaks in this area,
said Kate, looking at the 2 big trees. The 3 friends ran to the oak trees and looked around. There was a lot of tall grass under them. Suddenly, Mike said,
Look, under the grass there's a small tombstone, and half of it is underground. Let's try and pull it out.
They slowly pulled it out and looked at the name on the tombstone.
Well, it's difficult to read, but I think it says Juan Martinez, 1570 to 1605,
said Mike.
It's the name of the sea captain the pirates killed,
said Carlos excitedly.
He was Isabella Estrada's husband. Could Captain Salamanca's treasure be here?
What do you mean?
Asked Kate.
This is where Juan Martinez is buried.
Yes,
cried Carlos.
It's the perfect hiding place.
There's only one way to find out,
said Mike.
We have to dig.
Aren't you afraid?
Asked Kate.
Isn't it bad luck?
I just want to dig under the tombstone,
said Mike.
But we don't have a spade,
said Carlos. The 3 friends were silent for a moment.
You know,
Said Kate.
Dad has 2 spades on the boat. He uses them for his work.
Oh, that means we have to tell Mom and Dad,
Said Mike.
I think so.
Said Kate.
I'm sure they'll help us. They always do. We can tell them at dinner.
That evening at dinner, Kate, Mike, and Carlos told Mr. and Mrs. Sullivan the whole story. They stopped eating and were very surprised, but they were not angry. They decided to help the 3 friends,
This is an exciting adventure.
said Mrs. Sullivan.
And you guys are very good detectives. We'll help you.
If you find the treasure, we'll have to call the California Archaeological Society,
said Mr. Sullivan.
because the treasure belongs to the state of California. Tomorrow morning, we'll go to the old Spanish lighthouse and start digging. Who knows what we'll find?
By 10 o'clock the next morning, they were at the old Spanish lighthouse. Mr. Sullivan gave Mike and Carlos 2 spades, and they started digging. They dug for a short time, and suddenly Carlos's spade hit something hard. He stopped digging and looked at Mike.
I found something,
Cried Carlos.
Let me help you.
Said Mr. Sullivan. They pulled a small wooden treasure chest out of the ground. It was heavy,
Wow.
said Kate and Mrs. Sullivan, looking at it.
This is hard to believe.
Said Mr. Sullivan.
Can we open it?
Asked Mike.
Yes, of course.
Said Mr. Sullivan.
Let's see what's inside.
The lock was broken, and Carlos and Mike slowly opened the treasure chest. It was full of gold and silver coins, jewelry, pearls, and a king's crown.
Wow.
They all cried. They couldn't believe their eyes,
Look at all of these gold and silver coins.
cried Kate. Everyone stared at the treasure in silence, but no one touched it.
A pirate probably hid this treasure here in the 1600s.
Said Carlos.
Another pirate knew about it and planned to come here and dig up the treasure.
Yeah.
Said Mike.
And someone killed him because he didn't want to tell his secret.
But he wrote his secret on a piece of paper and put it in his hat.
said Kate.
And we found it after 400 years.
Why did Captain Salamanca have the treasure map?
Asked Carlos.
That's a mystery.
Said Mike, smiling.
What an exciting story.
Said Mrs. Sullivan.
Captain Salamanca's treasure map brought you good luck.
People don't find treasures every day in California.
Said Mr. Sullivan.
Now, I'm going to call the California Archaeological Society in San Francisco. They'll be very surprised and happy.
What's going to happen to the treasure?
Asked Mike.
Archaeologists will study the treasure first,
Said Mr. Sullivan.
and then they'll probably take it to one of the Californian museums. Journalists may want to write about you in the newspaper.
Our names in the newspaper?
Said Kate happily.
That's exciting.
Of course.
Said Mrs. Sullivan.
Your adventure will be in all the papers and maybe on TV.
We're proud of you.
Said Mr. Sullivan, smiling.
And of you too, Lucky.
Lucky barked happily and ran around the treasure chest. Everyone laughed, and Mrs. Sullivan said,
Well, you didn't get bored on this vacation.
Bored?
The three friends said,
Never!